Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. Breaking news. A power-hungry HOA Karen thought she had one until she realized the man she reported was a judge, one with zero patience for nonsense. What happened next? Let's just say Karen ended up where she least expected, facing the very law she tried to abuse. The peaceful, picturesque neighborhood of HOA Estates was meant to be a sanctuary for those who wanted quiet, stability, and a sense of community. The Homeowners Association was supposed to keep everything in order, but for years it had become a dictatorship under one woman, Karen Wilkins. Karen wasn't just the HOA president. She considered herself its queen. With her clipboard, ever-watchful eyes, and an army of snitchers, she ruled the neighborhood from the height of grass blades to the shade of front doors. Nothing escaped her notice, and if anyone dared to defy her, they'd be slapped with a fine, a warning, or in extreme cases, an attempt at public shaming in the community newsletter. Then came Daniel Carter, a quiet, polite man in his early 60s who had just moved into HOA Estates after retiring from a long and respected career in law. Most people had no idea who he was. He didn't introduce himself with flair. He didn't brag about his past. He just moved into his modest yet elegant home on the corner of Willow Lane, tended to his garden, and greeted neighbors with a warm nod. Karen immediately hated him. Something about the way Daniel didn't jump at her every word irked her. He didn't act impressed when she introduced herself as the longest-serving HOA president in neighborhood history. He didn't engage in the HOA gossip, didn't volunteer for committees, and most offensively, he didn't ask for her permission when he made minor changes to his property. The first confrontation happened on a crisp Saturday morning when Karen marched up to his house, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me, sir, this mailbox isn't in compliance with HOA standards." Daniel looked at her, then at the perfectly normal mailbox in question. It was sturdy, well-maintained, and in a neutral color. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked calmly. "It's not the correct shade of brown," Karen snapped, pointing at her notes. Daniel studied the HOA guidelines, then his mailbox. They were identical. "I believe this shade is within regulations," he said. Karen's eyes narrowed. She wasn't used to pushback. Most people either rolled over or begged her not to issue a violation. "I'll make the final decisions on compliance," she huffed. Daniel sighed. "That's interesting because from my understanding, HOA presidents don't have unilateral authority. The rules are set by the board, and they require proper voting procedures." Karen visibly bristled. From that moment on, Daniel Carter was enemy number one. The violation notices started piling up. First, it was the mailbox, then his lawn. Apparently, his grass was half an inch too high. Then his garden hose was unsightly. And then his car was parked a few inches too far left in his own driveway. Each time, Daniel responded politely but firmly, citing HOA laws and calmly explaining why she was mistaken. He even offered to discuss the issues at an HOA meeting, which only made Karen angrier and more determined to make him fold. Karen called for a special HOA meeting to discuss a homeowner who refuses to follow the rules. Daniel showed up dressed neatly in a casual button-up shirt and slacks. Karen, flanked by her loyal board members, launched into a dramatic speech about how some people in the neighborhood thought they were above the rules. "We need to set an example," she declared, glaring at Daniel. "If we don't enforce these regulations, this neighborhood will fall apart." Daniel let her finish, then calmly took the floor. "Madam President, may I ask a few questions?" Karen smirked. "Oh, now you care about the rules?" "I always have, which is why I took the liberty of reviewing the HOA charter." He pulled out a well-worn booklet and opened it to a specific page. "It states here that all HOA enforcement actions require a board vote. I see no record of any vote regarding the fines issued against me. That would mean these fines are in fact illegal." The room went silent. Karen froze. Furthermore, Daniel continued slowly and methodically. Section 4.3 states that board members cannot single-handedly create new regulations without proper homeowner input. So these new rules you introduced last month, those are void as well. The smug look on Karen's face vanished. Some of the other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. and a few neighbors whispered among themselves. For the first time in years, Karen felt control slipping through her fingers. She stormed out of the meeting, humiliated but more determined than ever. If the judge wanted a war, she'd give him one. Karen seethed as she stormed away from the HOA meeting. She had never been humiliated like that before. How dare that man talk back to her in front of everyone? He had made her look incompetent. No, powerless, and Karen would not stand for it. That night, she sat in her home, sipping a glass of cheap wine and scrolling through the HOA guidelines. The rage inside her burned hotter with each sip. If she couldn't beat Daniel Carter with rules, she'd bend them. The next morning, the real war began. The HOA's dirty tactics began. Karen summoned her most loyal HOA enforcers, a small group of equally nosy, power-hungry board members who thrived on control. "We need to get rid of this man," Karen declared, tapping a finger on her clipboard. "He is a menace to our authority." One of her lackeys, Marge, nodded furiously. "The way he spoke to you was completely disrespectful." "I know," Karen said, shaking her head dramatically. "He is undermining everything we've built." Of course, what they had built was nothing more than a glorified extortion scheme. Karen used nonsense fines and made-up violations to control homeowners and keep them in constant fear of the HOA. Most people paid the fines just to avoid confrontation, but Daniel Carter, scanning the words, "Mrs. Wilkins, I would advise you to be very careful about weaponizing the law. It tends to bite back. I suggest you cease your actions before this escalates further. Some of us know exactly how the legal system works. Some of us also know exactly how to make sure it works against those who abuse it. Consider this your only warning." Karen's hands trembled as she read the letter. Her eyes darted to her security cameras. She rewound the footage. No one had dropped off the letter. How did he get it in her mailbox without being seen? A chill ran down her spine, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "You want war, Judge Carter?" she muttered, crumpling the letter. "You got one." Karen's next big move was a fatal mistake. Determined to destroy Daniel, Karen took things too far. She ordered the HOA maintenance team to perform an emergency inspection of Daniel's property while he was away. At 10 a.m., 2 HOA workers arrived. They hopped the fence, claiming it was an official HOA inspection. They snapped photos, rifled through his backyard, and even tried to peek inside his garage windows. They didn't notice the hidden security cameras recording every move. By the time they left, they thought they had one, but what they didn't know was that Daniel was watching it all live from his phone. He smiled coldly as he zoomed in on their faces. "That's breaking and entering, Karen," he murmured to himself. "And I think it's time you learned what happens when you mess with the law." Karen leaned back in her chair, smug as ever, as she scrolled through the photos her maintenance team had taken of Daniel Carter's backyard. Finally, she had something. "He has an unauthorized structure," she muttered, zooming in on an image of a small shed in the corner of his property and an unregistered vehicle in his garage. Of course, neither of these things were actual violations. Daniel's shed had been there long before he moved in, and the vehicle, a covered classic car, was perfectly legal to store on private property. But Karen didn't care. She had proof, or at least she thought she did. She grabbed her phone and dialed the HOA's attorney. "We need to file a lawsuit," she announced the moment he answered. "One of our homeowners is in gross violation of HOA policies." The lawyer said, "Karen, we've talked about this. You can't keep targeting this man if you don't have an actual case. You're just wasting HOA funds." Karen gritted her teeth. "I have evidence," she snapped, forwarding the photos. There was a long silence. "Then how did you get these pictures?" the lawyer asked. "HOA inspection," she said quickly, "without the homeowner's consent." Karen hesitated, then scoffed. "The HOA has the right to inspect properties." "Not like this," the lawyer replied, his voice suddenly cold. "Karen, this is illegal." Karen rolled her eyes. "So what? It's a technicality." "No, Karen, it's breaking and entering. If Kara finds out, he could file criminal charges against you." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Karen's mind, but then she shook her head. No, Daniel wouldn't do anything. He was bluffing. She hung up and immediately drafted an official HOA lawsuit against Daniel Carter, claiming he was in violation of multiple bylaws and owed the HOA thousands in fines. She didn't know it yet, but that was the biggest mistake of her life. The next morning, Daniel stepped onto his porch, sipping a hot cup of coffee when a process server arrived, handing him an envelope. Daniel read the lawsuit, eyebrows slightly raising as he scanned the ridiculous claims. Then he chuckled, a soft, amused sound. "You really shouldn't have done that, Karen," he murmured. He went inside, sat at his desk, and drafted his response. But instead of just dismissing the lawsuit, he filed a counterclaim, and this one was real. Karen was in high spirits the next evening when she gathered her board members for an emergency HOA meeting. "I've taken care of everything," she boasted, tossing a copy of the lawsuit onto the table. "This will either bankrupt Daniel or force him to leave. Either way, we win." She expected cheers. Instead, she got nervous silence. Marge cleared her throat. "Karen, have you seen the news?" Karen frowned. "What are you talking about?" Marge slid her phone across the table. Karen stared at the screen. A local news headline flashed in bold letters. Homeowners Association president sued for harassment, trespassing, and abuse of power. Federal judge files criminal complaint. Karen's breath caught in her throat. She snatched the phone, reading the article in stunned disbelief. Federal judge? Karen's hands started shaking. No, that's not possible." Marge paled. "Karen, you didn't know? Daniel Carter is a retired federal judge. He served on the bench for over 30 years. Karen felt sick. Her mouth opened and closed. Then her phone rang. She answered it automatically. "Karen Wilkins?" "Yes. This is Detective Morgan with the Oge Police Department. We need you to come down to the station to discuss a criminal trespassing complaint that's been filed against you." Karen's vision blurred. Her knees nearly buckled. "What?" she whispered. "Mrs. Wilkins, we have security footage showing you ordered an illegal entry onto private property. I'd advise you to cooperate." The line went dead. Karen slowly lowered the phone. Her board members were staring at her in horror. She turned to Marge. "What do I do?" Marge just shook her head. "You messed with the wrong person, Karen." 2 days later, Karen sat in a courtroom, hands clenched in her lap as the judge called the case. She stole a glance at Daniel. He sat calmly, a faint, unreadable smile on his face. The judge didn't look amused. "Mrs. Wilkins," the judge began, adjusting his glasses, "it appears you have been using the HOA as a personal weapon to harass a homeowner. Furthermore, the evidence clearly shows that you authorized an unlawful entry into private property." Karen tried to speak. "Your Honor, Be quiet, Mrs. Wilkins." Karen flinched. "Your actions are not just unethical," the judge continued. "They are criminal. And considering that the homeowner you targeted happens to be a retired federal judge, I imagine you're starting to understand just how serious this is." Karen's face drained of color. Daniel simply watched. Now the judge said, flipping through the case files, "You have 2 choices. 1, plead guilty to harassment, trespassing, and abuse of authority, and accept the penalties that come with it. Or 2, we take this to trial, where I assure you the consequences will be much worse." Karen's heart pounded. A trial against a federal judge? She had lost completely. Her reign as HOA queen was over. She swallowed hard. "I plead guilty, Your Honor." Daniel's smile widened just slightly. The judge nodded. Wise decision. By the end of the week, Karen was officially removed as HOA president. She was ordered to pay thousands in fines and damages, not just to Daniel, but to other homeowners she had wronged. Her reputation was destroyed. The HOA board, in an act of self-preservation, voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. And Karen? She lost everything. Her power, her influence, her ability to control anyone ever again. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter enjoyed his peaceful retirement. Occasionally, he'd sip his coffee and glance at Karen's old house, now occupied by new owners who didn't have to deal with an HOA dictator. And if he ever saw Karen in town, he'd simply give her that same polite, knowing smile. Because some battles are won with force, but others are won with the law. Karen sat in her dimly lit living room, gripping a glass of wine with trembling fingers. She had lost everything: the HOA presidency, her influence, and worst of all, her power. Just days ago, she was the queen of the neighborhood, feared and obeyed by all. Now she was the neighborhood joke. Her HOA board had abandoned her, throwing her under the bus to protect themselves. The court had officially removed her from her position, slapped her with thousands in fines, and worst of all, she now had a criminal record: trespassing, harassment, abuse of authority. It was all public record now, her name plastered across news articles and local blogs. She took a shaky sip of wine, trying to block out the humiliation, but the sound of laughter outside made her flinch. Peeking through the blinds, she saw her neighbors, Daniel among them, having a casual conversation by the sidewalk. She gritted her teeth. They were celebrating, and Karen was no longer invited. Karen's reputation crumbled. Karen had never been particularly well-liked, but people had feared her, and that was enough. Now, with her power stripped away, her past abuses came back to haunt her. One by one, her neighbors came forward with their own horror stories. Mr. Thompson, the elderly man down the street, revealed that Karen had fined him $500 for having an improperly placed garden gnome. The Johnsons, a young couple, admitted that Karen once tried to have their dog removed for being too loud. Even though their dog was deaf, Mrs. Lopez, a widow, recalled how Karen had forced her to repaint her house 3 times in a year because the colors were too bright. With no HOA to back her up, all Karen could do was listen in horror as her former subjects laughed at her downfall. And it wasn't just her neighbors. The internet had gotten hold of the story. Reddit threads, news reports, even a viral YouTube video titled, "HOA, Karen calls the cops on a judge, ends up in court herself." The comments were brutal. You love to see Karen in action. Imagine dedicating your entire life to being a power-hungry HOA tyrant just to lose to a retired federal judge. She deserves everything coming to her. Karen deleted all her social media accounts, but it was too late. Her name was out there. The final blow: Karen faced a civil lawsuit. Just when Karen thought things couldn't get worse, a certified letter arrived at her doorstep. At first, she assumed it was another fine, but when she read it, her stomach dropped. It was a civil lawsuit filed by multiple homeowners she had wronged over the years. Daniel wasn't even the only plaintiff. 6 other homeowners had joined forces to sue her for unlawful fines and fees, harassment, emotional distress, and illegally using HOA funds for personal expenses. Karen's head spun. "This can't be happening," she muttered, gripping the letter. Her bank account was already bleeding from the fines she had to pay. If she lost this lawsuit, she'd be ruined. She immediately called her old HOA attorney. "I need help," she blurted out the moment he answered. A long sigh. "Karen," he said, voice cold, "I told you to stop. I told you to back off, but you didn't listen. Now you want my help." "Please," she whispered. "I don't have anyone else." The attorney paused. "Then I'm sorry, Karen. You're on your own." The line went dead. Karen stared at her phone. For the first time in her life, she had no power, no allies, no way out. Daniel's ultimate victory. Karen's downfall should have been enough, but karma wasn't done with her yet. The homeowners won their lawsuit. The court ordered Karen to pay back thousands in improperly collected fines and damages. And since she didn't have the money, she was forced to sell her house. The very home she had once ruled the neighborhood from was now up for sale. And the worst part? No one in the neighborhood wanted to buy it. Karen had made so many enemies that no one even wanted to live in the house she once occupied. She was forced to sell below market value, losing even more money. Where's Karen now? After losing her home, Karen moved out of Oj Estates. Rumors spread about her new life. Some said she had moved into a tiny apartment in a rundown part of town. Others whispered that she had taken a retail job just to survive. Then one day, Daniel Carter walked into a local department store. As he browsed the aisles, a familiar voice rang out. "Would you like to sign up for our store reward program?" Daniel turned slowly, standing there in shock. A cheap red uniform. Karen's eyes widened in horror as she recognized him. For a long, tense moment, they just stared at each other. Then Daniel smiled. Not a smug smile, not a cruel one, just a polite, knowing smile. "No, thank you," he said pleasantly before walking away. Karen stood there, paralyzed, as the reality of her new life sank in. She had once been the most powerful person in the neighborhood. Now she was just another cashier in a store where she had no control. And the best part? Her new boss was just as petty and strict as she had once been. A perfect poetic end to an HOA tyrant. Justice was served, and Karen learned the hard way that power trips don't pay off. What do you think? Was the punishment enough? Let us know in the comments. And if you love seeing HOA tyrants get what they deserve, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon. More crazy HOA stories are coming your way.